record.
Hello everyone, and hello to my wonderful guest and friend and colleague today, Dr. Patricia Worby. And we're going to be talking about all things to do with recovery, as always, and health. And we're going to be looking at an exciting new thing, because you have brought out your new book, which I haven't had a chance to fully read yet. So we'll be looking at more detail from my perspective as a reader later on. But Patricia, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about this lovely book that's come out, and we can explore the ideas around that.
Sure. Hi, everybody. So you may know I started publishing about 4 years ago, and I wrote one book and I self-published it, and was so excited by doing that I can't stop. And now this is my third. But the subject of this one, I had a view that I needed to tackle aging, but I needed to do it in a way that was not conventional. So we wouldn't be talking about, you know, the common view of aging and how it's inevitable and, you know, it's luck of the draw and it's all down to your genes and all of that nonsense. I wanted to look at it from a cellular point of view. I wanted to bring in the science, but I also wanted to look at the holism and how we can influence our cells to change the rate at which they age, okay? So I called it Losing Our Minds. Subtitle is A Cellular View of Life and Healthy Aging. But Losing Our Minds was the title I first got. I mean, I don't know if you're a bit like this, Jane, but you get like a inspiration of something, and it's like, why am I going to call it that? Well, it's a play on words, obviously, losing our minds. You know, when you look at dementia and, you know, the terrible epidemic we're in at the moment of inflammation in the brain, and literally losing our minds as we age, which is a very distressing situation for the person and also for their nearest and dearest. But also because in the new understanding and the new biological view of life, the mind of the cell is not the center of the cell. It's not the nucleus with the DNA, which is how we always understood it, but it's actually a combination of things. It's the cellular membrane and the proteins that are embedded there and what they let in and what they don't let in and how they communicate with the outside world. And it's also the mitochondria, which I know we've mentioned many times in our talks because they are so key to health. And they're little organelles that float around in the cytoplasm or cell fluid around the nucleus. And we found out so much about mitochondria in the last 10, 15 years. And they seem to be more than just, say, energy factories, which is how we understood them. They're actually signaling molecules, and they have the ability to communicate with each other, much like bacteria do, because in fact, they're descended from bacteria. They have the same way of replicating and also forming energy. And it seems that several 100 million years ago, bacteria came to live within the cell, and they sort of merged with it, and then they became absorbed as a general part of the cell, and they became our mitochondria. So it's really about understanding the cell as an entity that is intelligent. And thus, when you group cells together within the body, you create this field, or I even want to say network of intelligence. And how we age is linked to how well we communicate well-being to this cellular network. Things like the thoughts we think, obviously the food we eat, very obviously nutrition has a massive part to play, as does the amount of exercise we do, whether we do it in the open air and we breathe and we access sunlight, how well we sleep. But it's also the psychological, because it's mind and body. And what's interesting, one of the things I found out while researching the book was that the value systems you live within, whether you live according to your values, in other words, as a direct message to the cell of either degradation, known chemically as catabolism, or building and repair, known as anabolism or anabolism. Even I can't say that word. So you've got a direct result of whether you live according to values that support and nurture and enhance you. So that was a really massive understanding that I didn't have before.
So important.
Yeah. So there are many ways in which you can feed through the message of health and healing. And it's not just the obvious things. It's so broad, in other words, that we have to pull all this information in, and then we have to act on it, of course, because it's not enough just to know this stuff, but we have to make decisions that are sometimes difficult about the relationships we have or the jobs we do. I know that you've recently started, really pulling together your ideas on what you want to do with the rest of your life. And I know aging is really important to you too, because you've had negative views of aging, as we all have. We've imbibed them, haven't we? So I'm trying to smash that apart in the nicest way possible, and just rewrite this understanding of aging, because it's really not true that we are inevitably going to decline.
Oh, I'm so delighted. I'm really looking forward to getting my teeth into your book, because I've been reading around this for a long time, and certainly in the last few years it's become really my passion. Right from when I was at university studying psychology, the brain was, to me, I just thought, this is where we have to be all the time. We have to understand what's happening in our brains. But what's really interesting from what you've said there, and our knowledge generally about the mind body, is that it is all one. And isn't it fascinating how we used to think of the brain as being this sort of separate entity, and the body being a different thing. And now, and you only have to say to someone, I know this is terribly simplistic compared to what you're describing at the cellular level, but if we say to someone, well, just imagine that you have just been angry about something, or you're disappointed. And when you do that and you pull a face, or you look, you're sad or whatever, you feel different. And we can see someone else, our friend, we can see their body change and shift. You and I have talked about this many times, haven't we, before? And we have when we've been recording as well. So that our body sinks, or we look a bit tired, and we know that there's a physiological effect. So that one word that we've said, the phrase or the reaction or the response or the emotional way that we're dealing with our lives, or the thoughts that we're having, we know, and everybody starts to accept, well, actually, you're right. Of course it's having an effect on my body. And it's a two-way thing. If my body feels achy and tired, I don't feel terribly lively and full of ideas. I don't feel as creative because I'm suffering pain. And so that's it on a more macro level, isn't it? But it's all part of the same thing. And as you know, I'm starting some work with clients, with a group of people in Ludlow, where I live now. I do most of my work online with one-to-one clients, but I really want to do some hands-on work. It's lovely working with real people in a physical setting. And my passion is about regaining your brain, and the fact that as we're getting older, we've been told for so long that, well, it'll just go downhill. And once it's going downhill, well, you know where you're heading, don't you? And we're all been warned about Alzheimer's, and we've all, as you said, had experience somewhere in our family or with friends that we know what happens. And it's so horrendous that we don't want to even imagine us getting it. But then we start getting little giveaway signs of not quite remembering things. So, the losing the car keys becomes an everyday occurrence, whereas before it was maybe once every 2 weeks, and people are starting to forget names of people that they did know before, and so on. And everyone has been told that this is, oh yeah, well, you're over 50, aren't you? So, it's just going to keep going downhill. And all that we're studying, and you and I, we're studying the same information, you from a very much more scientific point of view, which I find so incredibly inspiring for me. And I'm looking more and more practically, which I love the fact you're bringing this in so much to your work, which not everyone's doing. So this idea of, it's all right understanding what goes on, but what are we going to do with the understanding? So that, we need to change how we live our lives. And you made me think then about when things are hard to do, we don't want to do them. We shy away. So, whether it's reading, a good example is reading a really complicated textbook. And people have said to me, and I've had the same experience, you get to the point where you just think, oh my gosh, I've read that 3 times and I haven't got a clue what that means, or it's too much for my brain. And we should close the book and we go and watch something on television instead, because it just feels as if we just could do with had time to relax. Actually, it's when things are hard and they feel complex and difficult for our brain that we need to pursue them, don't we? And that's what I'm going to be looking at in the classes, the group work I'm going to be doing, so that it's really bringing into everyday life, our ordinary lives, what can we change? You know, that people will have read about these kind of ideas. They've been there for years now, but they are critical now that we do these things, so that the brain, in my understanding, and you might be able to explain this differently than I can, the brain, you know, uses 25% of the body's energy on average. So it's using all this energy all the time, which of course, and it's an incredibly complex set of communication organisms in the brain, all the different parts of the brain and so on. So the brain has been designed, if you like, over all these years as life became complex, to simplify things. So the brain says, well, we can do that. So in other words, someone who drives to work by the usual route, their brain knows where they're going and they don't have to pay very much attention. And from the brain point of view, that's a great success. But of course, from an aging perspective, we know that the brain then it's firing on those particular pathways. We ask it to do something different, and it isn't used to the new things. So it'll say, no, let's just carry on with that one. So people start feeling overwhelmed by new things. They start not, and they will say, oh, well, I don't go there. I've talked to many people recently who are saying things like, oh, no, I don't really drive from dusk onwards. I don't feel comfortable. And no, I don't like driving to that area because, you know, the signage is difficult and it's the busy roads. And thinking, just a minute, this is someone who can drive perfectly well. But they've already decided that it's too hard to deal with situations that aren't their everyday ones. And so all we're doing is we're making our world smaller and smaller in lots of different ways, not even necessarily communicating with other people as much, and which we know is the precursor to this cognitive decline, or part of the cognitive decline.
Yes, it is, yeah.
That we all see. And so that it's, from my perspective, it's that understanding that, well, okay then, so tomorrow you go a different way. You choose a different way, whether you're walking, cycling, driving to work, you know, and that you just choose a new one every week. And you say, every Monday, I'm going to do a different way, even if it's one bit of road that's different, because your brain will then have to notice what's there. You'll take in sounds, smells, light, everything else. And you will have to calculate, which is all that, the calculation part of the brain as well, and mapping and planning. It sounds like such a little thing to do, but if we undertake to do the things that feel complicated and difficult, because we're so used to sticking with the patterns that we've got used to. And for example, sorry to go on, but it just gets me on that thought that, what do people say about older people? We all did it when we were young. They're set in their ways. They're stuck in one way of thinking. You know, oh, I know what he'll say, because he always says that as he's getting into his 70s or whatever. And so we can see that. I can see it in myself. And I just now have to think, okay, so is that my standard response to that sort of thing? Maybe I need to look at the other possibilities. Maybe my standard response, that always sounded very practical and logical, maybe it's out of date. Maybe it doesn't serve me all that well. Maybe I could be looking at other possibilities and change my mind. So that a lot of it's about this changing our mind. And that's where I like to focus, that we change our mind and we actually change our lives.
So what you've highlighted there is the importance of challenge. Okay, so change occurs when the default mode network, which is the sort of pattern of firing that generally happens every day because you do the same things, is challenged to find a new route. So you actually take on new neuronal connections. And what we now know is that the brain, far from being complete when you're born, because this is what we were taught, that you had all the brain cells you'll ever have, and then you decline, and it's a downhill slope, and it's just inevitable. Actually, particularly in an area of the brain called the hippocampus, and that's your memory center, by the way, has the ability to regrow neurons, actually to reform new cells and new connections. And new connections means new learning and new behaviors. So what we have to do is find ways that enhance our lives, but give us challenge and novelty. Novelty is really important because, as you say, otherwise you just keep doing the same things, and the brain gradually, what fires together wires together, this we know. But because it's looking to conserve energy, because it is so energy hungry, it will find the quickest way to do something. And the example you gave of driving to work, of course, is delegated to a part of the brain that is unconscious actually after a while. So you've probably had this experience where you've driven to work and you get there and you think, God, I don't even remember driving. I don't even remember getting here. Because the procedural memory part of your brain, which is more towards the mid-back brain, has taken it over for you because it's got so used to doing it. It's become procedural. It's become routine. And so in living our lives, we have to find ways that challenge us to not do so many things the way we've always done them. And so new learning is really, really key to enhancing this hippocampal growth, and thus giving us more awareness, more cognitive ability, because obviously we rely on memory to know who we are, to know who our nearest and dearest are, to know what it is we do in certain situations. So without good short-term memory, we find that the symptoms of Alzheimer's and dementia are creeping up on us. So, you know, losing your car keys, not remembering names, these are all procedural memory. So it behoves us to look after our brains as much as we would any other part of our body, with all the things I've already said. So good nutrition, really important. The mind, the brain is feeding this from the same blood vessels as the rest of your body. So what you feed it is important. The connections you make with other people, because we know, for instance, with dementia patients, you know, if they're able to have meaningful conversations, it transforms them. And what tends to happen in our culture in the West is we lump old people together, we put them in homes where they all nod off together on multiple medications in front of a TV that has no narrative interest for them. It's not, you know, and they all just go into a sort of stupor. We know that by introducing a more natural environment, in other words, getting outside, touching things, being involved with young people, children, you know, coming into that environment and challenging old people to interact, you know, to connect, to make new associations and new thoughts and feelings, that we start to actually halt, and it is even claimed reverse dementia, the loss of memory and the loss of cognitive awareness. So the point of my book actually was not so much dealing with that end of the spectrum, you know, although I do cover dementia and I do cover things like cancer as well, which is another age-related condition that we're all so scared of, was to sort of look at prevention from a intelligent, informed point of view at this stage of our lives. You know, whether you're 20 or 40 or 60, there are things you can do that actually will help you later on when you hit the age group where natural changes of aging do impact you. So prevention was really my key aim here, and healthy aging. I mean, I can give you an example is, you know, some of the people I meet, I mean, I don't know if they're being flattering, but I had someone come and help me from my website, and he's just a colleague and whatever, and we were talking about parents, and I said, well, look, you know, I'm considerably older than you. And he was like, well, how old are you then? And I said, well, you know, I'm 55. And he was like, whoa, I thought you were about the same age as me. And he's 44. And I said, well, thank you. You know, I'll take that compliment. But, you know, I'm not saying I'm perfect, and things are happening with my body that I'm having to deal with. Menopause, for instance, which is another whole discussion that we could come on to at some point.
Oh, yes.
For a woman, is, you know, there are challenges ahead, but I feel like I have a handle on it a little bit more. And I know that the choices I make now are going to have such a significant impact on what happens to me later. So that was really the whole point of writing the book.
Yeah, and that's why I'm looking forward to reading all the detail of your book, because that's really where my passion is. It's the fact that there's more and more evidence, and I'm sure you'd have described it all, but, you know, that really our brain in our late 20s sort of seems to move from being an acquirer to a user. So it's done all its acquiring. We're now living these lives where we seem to be able to get on okay, and it can rest a little bit more. It's not using as much energy from that point. So what we're having to think about, I think, from 30s onwards, you know, that's my understanding, is that the earlier we do this, the better. That we actually make sure we find time and a space in our lives to put, you know, energy into helping our brain to stay being an acquirer, so that we ask it to learn new things and we don't just get set into these patterns, which, as we know, they do serve us to a great extent because it uses less energy, but we all see ourselves doing it, and it feels easy. And one thing, I mean, I'm quite a bit older than you, and I have noticed changes. And as you know, I've had ME, chronic fatigue, most of my adult life, and I've only had a couple of years really since recovery. So, and the difference that has made of all those times of being bedridden and ill and not able to do the things I wanted to do and withdrawn from society because I didn't have an ounce of energy left and couldn't even speak properly. And I've met, as you have, many people through my, for my work who have experienced this or are still experiencing this. And our brain shows us that it's everything's tired. There's not enough energy to go around anyway, even just to get out of the house. So of course there isn't enough energy to do amazing things with our brain and our cognition. So I think that from my perspective, which is why I call myself a recovery specialist, it's not just about recovering from chronic fatigue type syndromes, but it's also recovering from illness, from trauma, from life events like divorce. It's all of those areas, all those difficult things we have to deal with, the challenges in our lives. We go through a phase, and for some people it's quite long. It can be years, can't it, of slowly coming out of the awful trauma of a bad divorce, a difficult divorce, for example. And the person, they're not creative, they're not able to do new things in that time. Of course they're not. But I want to help people in a preventative sense when we're looking at, well, what can we do, whatever our age, to keep ourselves vibrant and alive, because we want our brain to stay vibrant and alive until we just go downhill just before we die. And that's what scientists are now saying more and more of, is that if we're going to live to 120, that only sounds good if at 120, 119 point whatever, we start feeling a bit jaded, a bit downhill, and we have a heart attack or whatever. The bit of us that goes first is the one that's, will kill us off. But we don't want to be from 60 years old, be sitting as you were describing, which is how people are picturing old age right now, apart from the lucky few who keep their marbles, as we would say. And so we have to look at it in a different way, because there's no reason. I think there's a very small percentage, as far as I understand, who have a high risk of getting Alzheimer's. I haven't done my genetic testing yet, but I'm going to do that. However, that I will talk about another time, but that's a very hard thing to decide to do, because I'm already noticing brain changes and thinking, maybe I ought to find out how predisposed I am to this. And so I will do that this year. But I think, apart from some people who have, and there are very, we can talk another time about like Dale Bredeson's work about the different types of Alzheimer's. That's not our topic right now, but that there are different causes and so on. But for us, talking about that midlife bit where we no longer feel really young and we can tackle anything, we're beginning to feel physically a little bit, finding things much harder. We're perhaps not recovering quite as quickly from an injury, for example, or we don't find ourselves as able to cope with too many events happening at once. We more like to feel overwhelmed, which is one thing I notice. And I started, I don't know if I mentioned it before, but I joined a program of brain work. So it's a bit like doing computer games, which I have to say I've never really done. So it's a bit new for me anyway, but they are very cleverly designed, and I'll mention at the time what it's called and everything. But I'm mentioning it because there are different aspects of the brain that are being trained, if you like, so that the speed of how the brain's functioning and the attention span and memory, and they're all different aspects and very cleverly done in the games that I'm playing. And there are some of them that I can set off doing and think, oh, I can handle this, and I relax and I'm doing it quite well. There are others where I honestly don't quite know what I'm being asked to do to start with, so I have to work at it and try and work out what I'm being asked to do, and then I'll start doing it and think, oh yeah, I can do it, and then it speeds up slightly and I am gone. I can't do it at all. And then it's very clever because it reverts to making it easier again, and then it gets harder again, and I can't. And I'm good. But what I'm saying is that is so hard for me to sit down and do. I'm doing it every day. I've committed to doing it every day. And I tell you, there are days when I think, oh, I don't think I'll do it today. I'm tired. And no, come on, Jane, just do this because it's important. I've got to keep this working in my brain and really get my brain to stay younger than it is right now. And And it's hard to do. So I think that's where I'm coming from, is that we have to acknowledge that sometimes it's the hard stuff that we have to tackle, because of course we resist it because we want to do. Isn't it? And then getting rewards. So we'll look at that maybe next time, but that, you know, the novelty, as you mentioned, the challenge, the novelty and the reward is what we seem to need to have almost as a package for the brain to really move forward with it.
The reward is actually used in therapy as well. So if we're trying to make any changes in therapy, yes, we make people aware of a new feeling or new sensation, and then in order to embed that, we have to give them a feel good. We have to actually change their neurotransmitter balance, and I think it's glutamate, but don't shoot me down if I got that wrong. But I think dopamine is also involved. That embeds change. In other words, it makes it a new route that the brain will go through. So you've got to give people a good reason for doing what they're doing. You can't just sort of tell people you've got to do this. It's got to feel good. And absolutely. You mentioned trauma. I mean, that's another discussion, but there's a big part that has to get rid of the trauma out of the brain, because the brain remembers, part of its memory system is devoted to traumatic memory. And that takes up a huge amount of energy if you have not cleared your traumas, if you have not cleared events from your childhood, which we also call ACEs, adverse childhood experience, birth trauma, relational trauma. You know, you mentioned bad divorces or bullying or humiliations that you've endured through your life, and you're human, so you will have had some. Actually learning to clear I call it the mental attic, you know, taking out those memories from where they're stored into the hippocampus, where they can be date stamped, and therefore the brain knows they're over, means they don't keep triggering and firing this threat alert that you will be under otherwise. And that it's the cortisol from the stress response that largely destroys your neurons. It destroys your energy levels. It's very catabolic and very inflammatory. So we have to look at the whole picture of the human being and treat you as an individual with all your life experiences in order to bring you to a new awareness of what you need to do. But it has to feel good. If it doesn't feel good, you won't do it.
Yes.
You will say absolutely. You will, but you will gradually make excuses. So,
but you won't continue, I think. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think it's such an integral part of doing any sort of work. And it's the community aspect, which we were going to talk about anyway today, weren't we? That, you know, that the power of community, because which is partly why I've decided to do this as a group work with local people, where we can, because it can be fun. If it's not fun and people aren't getting something really positive from it, I'm not going to get people along to give them lots of challenges so they all feel miserable. You know what I mean? It's acknowledging that challenge is hard, and acknowledging sometimes we'd rather back away, and that sometimes it's good to face it, and because we know what we want out of it, we want to make positive changes. But also there has to be that element of community and fun and gain and positivity. Otherwise, as you say, we just won't do it.
No. And that is the way, if you think back to when you were a child, that is the way your brain grew or should have grown, through challenge. You know, the first time you got up on two legs and you started to toddle around the room until you fell over, and then you get up again. From the time you first went to school and you met all these frightening people and big people and other little people, and you were completely overwhelmed, but you learned gradually to find friends and support and your niche, whatever that was. That it's the only way we grow is to actually challenge ourselves, but it has to be supported and held with safety of other people who have maybe gone before us and done. And that's the purpose of teaching. It's the purpose of parenting, is to be ahead of your child and be able to encourage them. And we've kind of lost that a bit, because social media now compares us with our peers, and so it says, you know, we've got to be. I'm veering off a little bit, but this is how we don't get community support. We just get comparison and humiliation and judgment, and those are very negative you know, they have very negative effects on the brain. And so I think we have to do things very differently if we want to teach our children well and enhance ourselves as adults throughout our lives. Obviously, I realise we're drawing to a close, so I won't go into that into too much detail. But I do think it's so important that it should be linked to a sense of well-being, a sense of being with others who are going through similar challenges, and so we feel supported and safe. That is the key to learning, in my view.
Oh, I think that's a really good way to put it. Thanks for that. Because of course, if we're talking about an aging population, which, you know, we are doing now, and someone said to me just the other day, well, Jane, it's all very well saying we can all live to be 100, over 100, but should that's going to cost too much money? How can we possibly cope with that? And I said, well, actually, no. It would cost too much money if they're healthy. If we're all healthy at 100, we're giving back. We're still working in our communities. We're still helping people do things. We're helping educate the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren and volunteering and so on. That's not a drain on the society. But what we've got developing right now is a huge drain financially and in many other ways too, emotionally, isn't it? So that this is vital work now, that we are talking about not doing this for the sake of science, not doing this for the sake of having a better brain, but actually for living happier, healthier, more productive lives for longer. Because I don't want to be home not able to do anything in my life. There's no point.
No.
My dad used to say, can you give me a red pill if I get to that point? That's what he used to say, as if somehow we'd have conjured up a red pill by then that would, you know, that would be the end. But I mean, many people feel the same. So that this is about how do we, right from when we're young, approach life maybe in a slightly different way and actually start to talk about the importance of all of these aspects of reward and fun and belonging and sharing and as being really integral in our lives and very absolutely essential, in fact, for healthy long life. So we've got lots more things to look at the next time we talk. Every time we do this, I can think of about 10 different things we could go on and look at. And there's certainly one of them that's come up today, which I think we'll probably talk about at some point, not necessarily from this use of social media and the effect it's having on us all and the effect on the community as well. So that would be quite useful.
Good point.
So thanks ever so much, Patricia. Next time we talk, I hope I have read your new book and we'll be able to talk about that as well. So no challenge there, no pressure for me. We'll talk again soon anyway. That's been wonderful. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye everyone.
Bye everyone.